Today I want to talk about Matthew McConaughey and a recent interview he did, and how I think it exemplifies one of the ways in which ideology functions in America today. So to start off, I want to talk a little bit about what ideology exactly is. And to do so, I've pulled two quotes from the philosopher Slavoj Žižek, who is well known for his interpretation of ideology and applying it to our contemporary world. So the first quote reads, "Ideology is strong exactly because it is no longer experienced as ideology. We feel free because we lack the very language to articulate our unfreedom." The second quote goes, "On account of its all-pervasiveness, ideology appears as its own opposite, as non-ideology, as the core of our human identity underneath all the ideological labels." So what Zizek is saying there is that ideology is not how we might traditionally think about it. It's not the thing which we readily identify with. Say you're a Republican Party member and you identify with conservative ideology, or you're a liberal and you identify with the ideology of the Democratic Party. No, ideology is a bit more pernicious of a thing. It's almost invisible to us. Another way it has been put is that the one who proclaims that they're non-ideological is the most ideological. When we think we're outside of it, we're there at the very heart of ideology. In this sense, ideology is like the air we breathe. It's with us all the time in all that we say and all that we do. Now, this may seem a bit counterintuitive and a little bit abstract, but I think once we turn to this interview with Matthew McConaughey, it'll become readily clear to us. So Matthew McConaughey, he's been in the news a little bit recently. He just published a new autobiography, so he's been making all the rounds on the television networks, podcasts, and other media outlets. And along with this, there's been a little bit of talk about him running for the governor of Texas. The interview I'm looking at in particular was recently done on the Russell Brand podcast, and in this part of the interview, him and Russell are talking about how to reconcile the divide between, in Russell Brand's words, the liberal professional class and the ordinary working class. So I pulled a few clips from it, and we'll look at them, and then we'll talk about it.
Do you feel that there is a way of meshing together these apparently disparate groups now, these liberal professional classes and these what you might describe as working ordinary people of any color or variety?
That's my hope. I do think so, because the work I've got to do is defining the science behind why they're valuable, the science behind why they work, the science behind why that doesn't mean you have to now come over, and it doesn't mean that you're coming over to the proverbial other side. I say this, I say, I'll meet you in the middle. I actually think that is more of a dare right now than it's ever been.
Yeah.
That spot again is not like, oh no, not going there. Somebody said to me that I said, oh yeah, meet you in the middle. You know, it's in the middle of the road, McConaughey, yellow lines and dead armadillos. I said, let me tell you something, but I said, I'm walking down the yellow line right now, and the armadillos are running free, having a great time. I said, you know why? I said, the other two sides, the two vehicles on either side of the political aisle are so far apart, their fucking tires aren't even on the pavement anymore. I mean, so trust me, it's free over here. There's plenty of room, And I almost feel like it's a move to say, no, let's get aggressively centric. I dare you.
So in this clip, you can already see some of the things we were talking about with regard to ideology, especially this idea of one who thinks they're outside of ideology. In that clip there, Matthew McConaughey talks about the proverbial other side. It's like his use of air quotes seems to apply this sort of distance from ideology, that he's above ideological labels. He's not caught up in any sort of biased particular viewpoint. He simply takes a step back, can survey the landscape, come to the most pragmatic, right decision without having to have this decision already made for him in advance by his particular ideology. And that's exactly what the philosopher Slavoj Žižek was talking about when he's talking about this non-ideological person. Now, in the next clip, I think it'll become much clearer just how deep McConaughey actually is in an ideology. But But the other thing I want to point to in that clip is right there at the end, when McConaughey gives us this call to get aggressively centric. And I think it's emblematic of a wider phenomena in American politics called balance bias, which is essentially the idea that we must hear both sides of the argument on any particular issue, that we really do need to hear both sides so that we can weigh them each, and then we can come to a proper decision or resolution, that truth in the right way forward is often found in the middle. But when it comes to certain issues, not both sides of the argument are worth hearing. For instance, the philosopher Slavoj Žižek talks about how he would like to live in a society where he doesn't need to go around and constantly justify that sexual assault is wrong, that certain dogmatic operating principles are just fine to have. Another issue would be climate change. Do we really need to hear the other side of the climate change argument, that it's not real? No. In fact, we already know what's true, and it's a pressing issue that we must begin to address now, and there's particularly no reason to listen to the other side. This argument is often used to justify Fox News' coverage. You should listen to Fox News and weigh it against the other networks, and then you'll be able to come to a good decision. It's good to hear both sides, and that's what justifies their coverage, even though they're probably producing outright lies. Another instance of this balance bias comes in the form of compromise or bipartisanship. We see this in Congress a lot, where whenever people are running their ads around the election time, they always talk about how they reached across the aisle and how we need to reach across the aisle, which is probably true in some instances, but how does this logic tend to play out? Well, just imagine that the Democrats wanted to put forward a bill to increase the minimum wage to $20. But already they know before they bring the bill forward that the Republicans will never go for that. So they better start off with giving 15. But that's already too much for the Republicans, and they're going to whittle it down even more. So when this compromise principle is brought to the negotiating table, Democrats especially have often already compromised themselves. And that some scholars have noted how this bias towards the middle, this balance bias, this adherence to compromise, has actually been what has allowed someone like Trump to come to power. We get these solutions, which are half measures. They're bandages, and they're easily ripped off in the next congressional session, and we're not fundamentally addressing any of the issues that are going on, which only causes them to exacerbate and causes certain tensions to rise, and certain figures can take control of those tensions and be elected into power, just as we saw with Trump. So when McConaughey talks about the armadillos are doing just fine on the middle of the road, on the yellow line, I often wonder, who are these armadillos and how are they doing just fine? Because if you look around, I don't think a lot of people are doing just fine.
That left has to see, this is I want to stay on topic, but this is where the left misses it for me, just as far as being a marketeer of a political side. When you say, hey, we want to get out the vote, we want people to be able to go vote, we're going to do a campaign to let people vote. I'm like, 100%. Yes, everyone. Is there anyone who would say no to that? That's universal. You have 100% of the audience going, I'm in. That's a constitutional right as an American. I'm in, yes. And then they can't help themselves. At the very end of it, they go, so we don't let those criminal bastards get backing off. And you're going, whoa. You're like, no, don't say the last part. You lost 50% of your audience. And that's, part of why so much of the nation of that 50% looks at us in Hollywood as like going, oh, yeah, another celebrity over there on the West Coasters and the elite in the Northeast. And that's what y'all say. Because even from just a sales point of view, don't tab that gotcha on the end, and then you have your audience is twice as big, and you're getting what you want. Even you're getting twice as much as you're getting two times as much as you would if you just didn't tab on that little stick it to them at the end.
So in this clip, I think McConaughey's really exemplifying this point about the one who thinks they're non-ideological is in fact deep in the heart of ideology, and that it's not something we readily identify with ideology, but it sort of undergirds or underscores all that we say and we do. In fact, when we think we're being non-ideological is when ideology is speaking through us. So taking that clip, for instance, when he's talking about the left's messaging about get out the vote, he's already telling on himself when he says, I'm just speaking from a marketeer perspective, from a sales perspective, as if this sort of economic language would be the neutral position, when in fact he's speaking directly the ideology of capitalism. I mean, listen to what he's saying there when he talks about the losing half your audience and thus not getting what you want. That if you had the whole audience, then you could get twice as much as what you wanted. But I often wonder what kind of political program would be one in which 100% of your audience agrees with you? What would be the whole point of debate to begin with? And when these people want to get out the vote and encourage a certain direction for the country, what's so wrong with them advocating that position? How is the proper political position the one to advocate nothing? That doesn't seem right. And again, when he's talking about what do you want, or getting what you want, whose want? To earn more money from the perspective of a Hollywood star, promoting politics, having a wider audience? He's speaking the very language of capitalism, and this is a very common phenomena that goes on within American society currently, that this neutral position is in fact advocating the ideology of capitalism, that somehow this market is the neutral position. Again, when we were talking about balance bias and just weighing the options, it's the same idea when people talk about the free marketplace of ideas. You know, the market is there at every instance, and what they don't realize is that is a fully loaded ideological statement, that you are advocating a certain way that things should run, the way resources should be distributed. So in fact, when McConaughey is speaking there about, just from a marketeer, as sort of almost outside of politics, that's actually when he's most directly talking about politics in a sense. Now, a little bit later in this interview, Brand is talking about how people who are disadvantaged often don't have a seat at the table, and that nobody's really open to hearing alternative economic systems. And McConaughey seems to agree with this, but if we follow what he says further, it totally goes against what Brand is saying. Because McConaughey responds to Brand by saying, how do you get a seat at the table? What is the thing we value most in American society to get a pat on the back? And Brand says, fame and money. And McConaughey goes, yep, fame and money, that's exactly right. And so now you'd be expecting him to go into a criticism of needing fame and money to be heard in society. But instead, McConaughey goes on to talk about a survey of 13-year-old girls from 12 years ago, where they were talked about how they all wanted to become famous. That was a prominent answer in this survey of young girls. They wanted to become famous. And he says that 30% of them identified how they were going to do that. Well, they were going to use a sex tape to get famous. And so then he begins talking about how we have this corruption of values, and basically points to as that being the wrong way of getting there. So he doesn't fundamentally challenge any of these values or the system that allows people to have political speech and representation in our system. Again, even though he thinks he's outside of ideology, he's there reproducing the fundamental coordinates or pillars and principles of the way that American society is currently functioning. Now, backgrounding this whole discussion between these two is another ideological form. And we saw it right there at the beginning when Brand sort of identifies the left as the professional managerial class, or when they're talking in the interview, whenever they refer to the left, they're talking about Hollywood elites, and that implies that the right is the ordinary working class. And what's so ideological about this is this sort of pre-understanding about this. It's not questioned in any way that these would be how the political spectrum would be divided up. And it goes back to a larger historical shift that occurred with the collapse of the Soviet Union. There's a very famous end of history thesis by the political scientist Francis Fukuyama. So after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, he proclaimed now there would be a triumph of liberal democracy, basically a triumph of capitalism. There would no longer be the sort of great struggle between the Soviet Union embodying socialism and the United States or the West embodying capitalism, that one had won out. And this really marks a shift from a class-based understanding of our political spectrum to a cultural-based understanding. Because if you think about it historically, this division of the right as salt of the earth, ordinary working people, and left as elites doesn't really hold up. It's actually a relatively new phenomenon within the last 2 decades or so. Because if you think just back to the 50s or the 30s, the salt of the earth working class people, the people working in factories and unions, that was the left wing. And the right wing was business owners and the wealthy. So we've seen this shift with the collapse of the Soviet Union and this move away from a class-based understanding of the world to cultural markers and signifiers as being the way to divvy up or make sense of these ideological labels of left and right. Now, they don't discuss that. That's just the sort of pre-understanding, this pre-given horizon that they make sense of political phenomena. It's what Foucault might call like the episteme, or Heidegger would call this historical disclosure of being. And so to distill this down one final time, we don't speak ideology. Ideology speaks us. It's what, to go back to the philosopher Slavoj Žižek, he would call unknown knowns. Things that we don't know or identify with or believe at the conscious level, but unconsciously we do believe them. They're there. They're effective in all the things that we say or that we do. It's what structures our behavior. So ideology is kind of like an understanding before understanding, a meta-understanding. It's what prefigures the act of thought. It's what's going to structure the very way in which we think or talk or analyze something. And all throughout that interview, Matthew McConaughey is exemplifying this idea of ideology. At all those moments when he thinks he's outside of it, beyond our problems, when he's talking about getting aggressively centric or compromise or bringing that 100% together, he's speaking the very dominant ideology. He's reproducing what, in my opinion, has gotten us to this very historical juncture, this fracturing that we see going on, which has allowed certain figures to take advantage of. The philosopher George Hegel was once remarked as saying that if the facts don't fit the theory, so much worse for the facts. And what Hegel means is that before we even think about it, a fact, we have this pre-understanding. We have a way of thinking that's going to allow the fact to even appear meaningful to us. We have to have a certain kind of theory or understanding which is going to allow that fact to appear for us in a certain way, that we're not just given an objective, solid fact that then we make sense of, that we are already implicated in the act of perceiving that very fact. And so, to conclude, I don't mean to say that Matthew McConaughey, he thinks he's getting outside of ideology, but in fact he's not, and there's another way out. No. There's no way outside of ideology. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't question our implicit understandings, that we shouldn't try to understand what is prefiguring our own understandings. In fact, that's the very substance of critical thinking. And we're going to have to engage in more of this kind of questioning if we're really going to see ourselves beyond the problems that currently face us.